All right, next we're going to start our section on evolution. We're going to begin with talking about the controversial nature of evolution. So it's a controversial subject. Why is it controversial? Because there's a diversity of viewpoints or opinions on evolution, and they're not just two opinions, there are actually several different opinions about evolution. Because there are people who have these kinds of viewpoints. Let's kind of list some of them out. This isn't exhaustive, but it's gives you kind of the feel for things. First of all, there are some that believe in the literal story from the Bible, literal Genesis. And they deny all aspects of evolution. Every bit of it. So there's that viewpoint. Next, there are some that would fall kind of in a little more accepting position. They still believe in the literal Genesis. And they accept some things like natural selection and microevolution. So they accept natural selection, the survival of the fittest concept. They think that's all right. They can go along with that, but they still hold to the literal Genesis. Next, there's some that are what we would call figurative. They believe the Genesis story is not literal in the way that it's presented. It's not maybe the 6 days of creation or something like that. So that's the figurative Genesis. Maybe allegorical or a story to help us understand things, but not a literal representation, but that God directs everything in evolution. Next, there are those who would go a little step further than that. They still have a figurative understanding of Genesis. They think that God initiated the universe, that he kind of started everything. It's the explanation for all matter and energy and so forth, but it started long billions of years ago, and the earth came into being through natural phenomena, and all the processes from there were just random type processes, just natural processes. So here they think God initiated the universe. The next level here is those that would deny any existence of a creator, and there's no God, and everything that happens is natural. So they deny God as a factor in the natural world. So that's why it's a controversial subject, and we'll kind of deal with this a little bit as we go through. Of course, this is a course in anatomy and a science course, so mainly what we will be looking at is scientific evidence that relates to our different topics. But just know that there are different people all around you with different kinds of viewpoints on this, and just as because one person has one viewpoint doesn't mean that they're not educated, that they don't know everything, all the facts and scientific information that you know, and so forth. So anyway, there are different people, different viewpoints on this evolutionary concept. All right, as we begin our study of evolution, one of the things we want to begin by talking about is what we understand as levels of scientific certainty. Most of you are familiar with the general idea of the scientific method, and you know that when we want to evaluate something scientifically, we begin with some kind of a statement of how we expect things to behave in nature, some kind of a hypothesis. A statement predicting or a possible explanation for some natural phenomenon that we see out there. It's a hypothesis. So there's really no support for that until we do some testing, some kind of experimentation, some way of evaluating things. So if we go out and we do some kind of experiment to try to evaluate our hypothesis, we look at some data and we pull it together and we get results that support our hypothesis. That doesn't mean automatically that it's a scientific law. The next level of certainty after the hypothesis is a theory. So if it's an idea that's supported by available evidence, we consider it a theory in science. Now, that does not conclude that it's a scientific law just because it's supported by some of our experimentation. There may be other possible explanations that have not been accounted for out there. But anyway, we can continue to explore this hypothesis and do other experiments. Here, supported by more evidence. Here, we're still a theory. It's a stronger theory possibly, but still a theory. And that continues on. And eventually, if we have enough evidence for this, and we may at some point come to our most certain condition and consider it a scientific law. If something is going to be upheld as a scientific law in our understanding, it needs to be supported by all experimentation. And all alternatives need to be disproven by experimentation. So, if there are other alternative ideas out there for the explanation of whatever we have the hypothesis for out there, other competing ideas, they may be supported by evidence as well. So you can have multiple theories out there working on any particular topic. And it's very difficult to get something to be a scientific law, to disprove things. Some things we find just are not practically testable. We just can't know them. It's just beyond our physical ability to do experimentation or whatever. And so anyway, it's very difficult to generate something that is actually a law in biology. There are many things out there that are given the name law because they're generally accepted, but not necessarily because they are supported by all experimentation and all alternatives are disproven by experimentation. So we're sometimes kind of liberal with our use of scientific law. It's a little easier in some forms of physics and chemistry to come up with things that are predictable, that always turn out the way we expect and so forth, and are repeatable by experimentation. We can do all experiments lead to the same conclusion. It's a little harder in biology, and what we consider the more soft sciences like sociology and so on, all of those kinds of things, it just gets more and more difficult to disprove alternatives to a particular idea or a concept. So biology is kind of in between those soft sciences and the more hard sciences in there. There are a lot of people who like to think of biology as purely a hard science, but it's not always the case. So anyway, when we talk about some of the evolutionary ideas in here, we'll consider how much evidence there is, how far we are along this progression from hypothesis to law in the middle. All right. Now, as we begin this discussion on evolution, I want you to know that evolution in biology is not just one thing. The term evolution, of course, just refers to any kind of change over time. So your opinion can change over time. Politics will change over time. History changes over time. So there are all these kinds of things that we can think of as evolving processes or conditions that surround us. But in terms of biology, we usually have one kind of thing in mind, and even just limiting to one particular kind of thing is not exactly correct, because everything that we're going to talk about here requires a different kind of scientific evaluation. Okay? So first of all, when we talk about evolution, we may be referring to the development of the first life form. That first reproducing cell. So if that's what we're thinking about, we need to come up with some kind of hypotheses that test to see if we can have life develop from a non-living planet kind of situation. So that's the kind of testing you would have to do. Can you generate those kinds of conditions and have those life forms develop from non-living materials? So that's one thing we think of sometimes when we're talking about evolution, the evolution of the first life out there. Next, what we call microevolution. This just refers to changes within a population, genetic changes within a population, so that there's variation that occurs within a population. We often think of antibiotic resistance here, or bugs becoming resistant to pesticides because of small changes in their genetic makeup, those kinds of things, or just different colors of dogs or of that sort of thing. So new forms that might show up within a lineage that we would call microevolution. And I have this called progressive tiers of biological evolution, because you can't get microevolution if you don't have a life form to start with. So you have to have reproducing cells to see any kind of microevolution. And the next one requires that there be genetic changes in populations. And that's what we know as natural selection. Survival of the fittest, natural selection. So you can't have one particular form preferred in the environment or by natural processes over another unless there's variation out there to form those different kinds. So the next thing that might happen, if we can get natural selection to occur, is that speciation occurs. So what used to be just one population and species of organism is become different forms in different localities, possibly, that have become so different from one another over time that they no longer are able to interbreed with one another. So there's reproductive isolation of the two groups, or two or more groups, that would result in what we call a speciation event. Next, macroevolution, and this is what most people think of when they hear about the theory of evolution, is that amphibians came from fish, and fish came from more primitive forms of life that looked more like a sponge or something of that sort. So anyway, this is macroevolution, this long-term evolutionary change that might occur based on speciation event after speciation event, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of different speciation events leading to all the different forms of life in our phylogenetic tree, our phylogenetic diagrams that we're going to be dealing with. So anyway, these are 5 different levels of meanings of evolution that are used in biology. They're all different things though, and they would require different kinds of experimentation and study to verify them as we go from a hypothetical condition to more and more evidence, or eventually to a scientific law. So anyway, evolution means multiple things, and multiple things to different people as well. So, all right, let's start looking at our 5 different progressive levels of evolution and talking a little bit about how much evidence there might be in support of those different levels. So, first one here was development of the first life form. How do we get there? Well, first of all, we have supposedly, as the Earth was forming, it was extremely hot. It was hard for molecules to come together and stay together. They would break apart more rapidly than they would form bonds. So a kind of cooling of the Earth was required to allow the formation of our first atmospheric molecules. So there's a number of steps that would be required here. So that would be like step 1 required for the development of the first life form. We've got to get molecules to come together in the atmosphere to form a basis for all the things that follow. Number 2, after we form some molecules in the atmosphere, further condensation of atmospheric molecules forms organic molecules. So we've got to get the formation of some organic molecules here. This is an interesting thing. I guess I saw something about a 50-year anniversary on a video the other day of this experiment, known commonly as Miller's experiment. In a laboratory, he set up a set of conditions inside of an enclosed number of tubes and bottles and such. And what he would do is he would evaporate some of these chemicals that were at the time thought to be similar to what the early Earth's atmosphere would be like. It's since been shown that the early Earth's atmosphere, there's some evidence that he was probably wrong about what would have been making up an early Earth's atmosphere. But anyway, at the time what they knew, they took it together and they put it into an enclosed chamber where they would heat it up and then let it condense and heat it up and let it condense and heat it up and let it condense, and occasionally put some electricity through it, a spark through the chamber to simulate lightning kinds of events and electrostatic events that would be present in the atmosphere. But anyway, these inorganic compounds, the supposedly early atmospheric compounds, were recycled through here, and eventually they ended up with some organic molecules forming in the bottom of their condensing bottles in there. So anyway, that's known as Miller's experiment, and it was thought to be some of the first evidence that could explain how we got organic molecules from inorganic conditions. Next, if there's nothing there to digest those organic molecules other than just normal breakdown processes from heat or radiation and so forth, then they might just accumulate. The more and more and more you get, the more thick the little pools of water on the Earth's surface would be with these undigested organic molecules, and that's what we refer to as the accumulation of organic soup. Sometimes described as a primordial soup. You'll hear that term referred to as well. So anyway, step 3, we get some pools thick with organic materials, so we have them all in the same place. Step 4, the formation of organic macromolecules. That means that some of these simple organic molecular shapes start to organize into larger structures, and some of these might resemble organelles, what they sometimes refer to as pre-organelles. Pre-organelles. So, we have a series of steps that were proposed here. We've got the cooling of the earth to allow atmospheric molecular formation. Condensation of some of those atmospheric molecular forms would form organic molecules. Then accumulation of organics in pools would allow for a formation of organic macromolecules or pre-organelles. And then step number 5, we get pre-organelle structures and macromolecules to come together and make the first reproducing cell. Now, we talked earlier about how we accumulate evidence for a hypothesis and see how far along we can carry that. Here, about the only good evidence we have, we can make in special environments organic macromolecules and such from inorganic materials, but we have to kind of control that environment very carefully to make that happen. We don't really know if that's would be similar to what would happen on a forming planet or not. And let's see, they've been able to take specific macromolecules and put them together to construct some like lipid envelopes and other chains of structures that resemble some of our macromolecules that are used in the cell. So you can replicate this, but your conditions have to be very specific to replicate that condition. And nobody yet has produced a reproducing cell in an enclosed environment, certainly not by starting with just a mix of things they think might have been in the early Earth's atmosphere. So this cannot be done or has not been done experimentally. So it's still hypothetical for the most part. There's very little evidence, some kind of, I don't want to call them cheating, but the conditions set up to reproduce some of these events have been very, very specific to end up with that particular outcome. So they're not very random kinds of processes that have been used to gain evidence for the development of pre-organelles and different organic molecules in here. So anyway, as far as going from one end of your hypothesis to your law, we're not very far into that to have much evidence for the formation of the first life form. All right, next, following formation of the first cell, the next concept in our evolutionary series was microevolution, as you recall. Microevolution, I have a little explanation for it here. Chromosomal errors in replication, cell division processes, and the mixing of the DNA at fertilization produces genetic variants in a population. So, if you know much cellular biology at all, you know what events occur with DNA so that it makes more copies of itself after a cell division. It needs to produce a second copy for the next cell division to send that on. And in the copying process, errors can occur. As cells divide, pieces of the chromosome can overlap and get detached and moved around in the chromosomal structure. So those kinds of cell division processes, and when two cells come together at fertilization and sexual reproduction, for those that have that, that produces a whole new mix of genetic information within a single organism by that process. So you have all these different means of mixing up the DNA and making changes in the DNA so that they're not all members of a population have exactly the same genetic information. There are variations within the population, an important factor. Now, is this testable? It's quite obvious all around us that this occurs, all the variation that you see in nature. We do it routinely with bacteria in a petri dish where we set up some kind of a condition, something that would stop bacterial growth and see if there are any bacteria that develop a different genetic composition that would allow them to overcome that antibiotic or whatever that hindrance in their development would be. So we see this all the time. So it is testable and provable, and we would consider this a scientific fact. There's no doubt that this occurs, that there are variants that form within a population. So the result is that not all members of the population have the same genetic information. Which sets the stage for the next thing in our list, and that will be natural selection. Okay, now this is our third item under types or levels of evolution. Natural selection, also known as survival of the fittest. This is well known to most people. It's kind of a logical kind of explanation for things. Basically, it says that because not all members of a population have the same genetic makeup, some may have a survival advantage. It's a very common concept. We tend to attribute this to all things we see in nature. The shape of a leaf is that shape because it was preferred by the environment, and those that had that shape were able to reproduce and better than others that maybe didn't have that particular shape of leaf. We often refer to things like the long neck of a giraffe. It got longer because it could feed off of higher things, didn't have to compete with those organisms, those animals that fed on leaves that were lower in the trees. So we have a lot of kind of anecdotal things that we ascribe to natural selection that we see in everything around us, really. All features of all creatures are thought to be selected for by their environment. So anyway, but testing it is a different problem. Just come up with an experiment that shows natural selection happening or evidences for natural selection in nature. So we have some what we consider common examples that have been used in textbooks and so on for years that are basically evidences for natural selection. And I want you to know these three evidences for natural selection. The first one being the peppered moth experiment. Peppered moth experiment. In this case, there are, and this was done in England, I believe. Well, anyway, there were species of moth that occurred, they observed to be in a dark form and a lighter form. They were both kind of patterned, and that's why it's called a peppered moth. The light ones had maybe a dusting of dark pigment in them, and the darker ones were mostly darkly dusted with pigment. So we have these two forms of moth. Someone thought that possibly in more rural areas, the normal moth color would be the lighter colored moths, because in the more rural areas, they didn't have the industrial smoke and soot that would settle out on all the surfaces and on buildings and trees and so forth. So, thinking that light colored moths had a higher survivorship out in the countryside where there was not the problem with the soot on surfaces, and dark moths would have a higher survivorship in cities where there was more soot and darkened surfaces for them to light on and not be visible to predators. They did this experiment. They marked equal numbers of dark colored and light colored moths and released those marked moths out into the countryside. And then they did the same thing in the city. They took a bunch of light colored moths and dark colored moths and marked them so that they would be able to recognize them when they caught them again, released them in the city environment. And then they went back later, supposedly, to collect moths in the countryside to see if more light colored moths than dark colored moths survived out in the countryside, and then collected in the city to see if more dark colored moths survived compared to the light colored moths in the city environment. And sure enough, their results tended to support this idea that light colored moths were selected for, didn't have as much predation in the countryside, and dark colored moths didn't have as much predation and were more abundant than in the city environment. So that's the peppered moth experiment, a classic example of survival of the fittest from the textbooks. So that general idea you could probably replicate in a number of different ways. Next, pesticide resistance. Pesticide resistance, and mostly insects we're talking about here, but it could go to other forms of things. We've observed, this is kind of not a controlled experiment, but a happenstance experiment that was done, where pesticides can be put onto any kind of a crop or environment to try to get rid of some kind of insect pest. So you find a chemical that works against it, and then there may be some variants of that insect that are genetically different and are not susceptible to that particular pesticides, or it's not as lethal to them. They survive. The other ones that don't have that genetic variant do not survive. So we only have reproduction of those that survive, and pretty soon all the members of that particular pest in your environment that you were trying to get rid of are represented by those that have the genetic resistance to the pesticides. So that's happened a number of times with different kinds of pesticides out there where we're trying to get rid of pests on crop plants. So a good example of selection for particular genetic information. It may not be considered all that kind of a natural event that would lead to speciation, but anyway, that's the idea there. Next, finch bill shape. This is in the Galapagos Islands, where they were looking at finches that had different bill shapes to eat different kinds of seeds. This is just one species we're talking about here, but there's some of the individuals of the species have a larger, thicker bill. Some of the individuals of the species have a smaller, thinner bill. Those that have the larger, thicker bill were thought to prefer larger seeds produced by some of the plants on the island. Those that had the smaller bill preferred some of these smaller seeds, or we could get by on smaller seeds out there in the environment from different plants. So a long-term experiment was set up where they looked at the availability of large seeds versus small seeds from these different plant types that was affected by annual climate variation. So in some years there would be more rain, in some years there'd be less rain, basically is how that worked. So in those seasons where you had the weather conditions that produced more large seed plants, you'd see the abundance of large seed or large-billed finches increase in the population. In those years where conditions were such that more of the small-seeded plants survived and produced seed, then there you'd see an uptick in the number of finches that had the smaller bill. So you'd see this fluctuation in the composition of the population based on the weather environments, but eventually on the availability of different seed types that were present. So a natural selection type of operation going on there, but within one species in that one population. So those are three examples that commonly come up when we're talking about the process of natural selection. It's a little bit difficult to test and come up with predictive models and actually end up with species that are actually selected for or against. Like I say, we usually just look at anecdotal information. We compare lizards on this island to lizards on that island, and we see differences, and we try to see how the environment may have influenced genetic changes that led to those different forms, whatever they might be. So we do most of this anecdotally, not much of it with highly controlled experimentation like these examples we have here. So anyway, natural selection, survival of the fittest, our third level of evolution from our list there. So if we have a life form and we can have microevolution in the life form, then we can get maybe survival of the fittest. And if we can have survival of the fittest, then in some places we'll get some forms maybe to be more fit, and other places we get other forms to be more fit for their environment, which would lead us possibly to speciation, which is our next topic. Okay, our next level or tier of evolution from our list, speciation. Speciation, the isolation of a reproducing lineage from other lineages of the taxon. So this one group, one lineage, becomes separate and no longer will reproduce with the others. Taxon was originally one species, but after the isolation of one lineage from another, we now have at least two or more taxa resulting from that, two or more species resulting from that. So that's the idea of speciation. The explanation for that, there are two different means that are proposed, allopatric or sympatric speciation, and most speciation events are assumed to be allopatric. So let's talk a little bit about allopatric speciation. I've mentioned before that allopatry means that they live in different geographic or physically separated locations. Allopatry, sympatry means that they are living within the same region and intermingling essentially. So allopatric speciation. The explanation for this is that first of all you have separation of the population of the species into different localities. So they may start out in the same location. Let me kind of do a diagram here. Say this is a desert region that contains a lizard species that lives within a desert region. Okay, so out around here we have forest surrounding a large central region of desert. And in this desert we have a lizard, a desert lizard. And this is population A. Okay? Over time, if conditions change, if the weather changes, we're going to look at this same region. And now our forests take over more of this island or whatever it is. So now we have some of our population divided to this region up here in the northwest and others down in the southeast on the other side over here. So we have a population over here, we have a population over here. We now have two populations of the same species. Group population A and population B. If we have enough reproducing generations in there, we're going to have some genetic variants of A pop up in this region. And some of those will be more fit than other forms of the population A. And those genetic changes that occur in here will result eventually in a different kind of organism than what we started with, just because of chance variation in chromosomal makeup. Same thing would be happening over here in B. There'd be genetic changes that pop up occasionally within population B, and over time B would no longer be like the original B population that was out there. So we have enough time for some changes. So first event in here is what we call geographic separation. of the populations. Step one, geographic separation. The next event would be genetic change within those populations. So over time, let's see, we'll go to the next thing here. We still have a population that are divided here, but now these populations divided by forest regions so that their desert habitat is just in those locations. We'll call them A plus and B plus because now they've changed over time to have different genetic makeup over here. So we have a time of genetic change that occurs between this point and this point here. And let's go one more. Let's say that the environment changes so that now these two populations, A and B, that are now different from each other genetically, become so different that they will not reproduce with one another when they come into contact with one another. So the desert expands again, forest retreats again over time, and we're left with a large desert area in the middle here. And our population A now extends, our A plus group is all through here. Our B plus group is all through here, and they overlap broadly within that whole desert area, and they don't interbreed with one another. So we have here, after our genetic change, we have reproductive isolation. So now we have two species where once we had one. This is the classic allopatric view of how two species would form from one in different locations. So this is fairly easy to understand, getting two species from one in this kind of proposed explanation. And we see in nature a lot of evidence that this may have occurred in the distributions and patterns of organisms across the face of the earth. Trying to understand why there are different species here and there and how they intermingle in some places, even though they might be similar and so forth. So these are the kinds of events. And I want you to know specifically the three steps of allopatric speciation, starting with geographic separation of populations, then genetic changes within those isolated populations, and then genetic changes that are to the extent that they are no longer reproductively compatible. There's reproductive isolation. So geographic separation, genetic change, and reproductive isolation are our three steps in the allopatric speciation process. That will probably come up in a test question. Now, sympatric speciation is a little bit different. How you get two species to develop where there's just one to start with. We don't have as many good examples of where that might be occurring. The one that's often referred to in textbooks these days has to do with the apple maggot fly, I believe is what it's called. But anyway, it's a small insect that was present in the United States before apples were brought over here. They had their larvae developing in the fruit of hawthorn berries primarily, or other fruits, and those were natural plants here in the U.S. and in the Americas. And once apples were brought in, some of those populations started using apple as a food source for their larvae. So that there were some of the flies that if they developed within an apple, they would go to apples to reproduce. If they developed within hawthorns, they were more likely to go to other hawthorns and reproduce there. So over time we have those populations that reproduce on apples and those that reproduce in their normal wild hawthorn plant, host plant. So knowing that, it's thought that eventually these populations would become so different that they would not be reproductively compatible. I don't know that that's been demonstrated. I don't think that there are complete genetic isolation, reproductive isolation between the populations that are present on apples and those that are present on the hawthorn. But anyway, that's an example of where you see at least separation of the species where they are not reproducing with one another. Will it eventually lead to reproductive isolation is the question. So it's hard to come up with explicit examples of where we know that or we think that probably has occurred. This whole process of speciation, demonstrating this whole thing, is not something you can do very well experimentally. Okay? We can't go out and conduct a 40 million year kind of experiment. It's just not practical. See what kinds of genetic changes would occur and so forth. So it's hard to get a handle on this. All we have are kind of somewhat anecdotal, I guess you would say, observational evidences that we see in nature, these kinds of trails of evidence in nature, but not something that can be reproduced experimentally. So as far as going from a hypothesis to a theory to a law, well, we can look at conditions that support the explanation that cause us to think of this as a theory, as a very reliable kind of theory, but we can't really think of it as something we can test over and over again experimentally. We can't control it. So anyway, that's speciation. So if we can get a living cell, then we can maybe see genetic variation. If we can see genetic variation, then maybe natural selection will work on populations. And if natural selection is working on populations, then some forms will be chosen for and against in divided populations, whatever causes the separation of the two reproducing groups, and eventually end up with new species from that. If we can end up with this speciation process and do it over and over and over and over and over again, over millions and millions and millions of years, then maybe we can have an explanation for macroevolution. So if we can't really do a good test of speciation, we can't do the experimental tests of macroevolution either. So the next things we're going to consider are evidences for macroevolution. So we're going to look at macroevolution in a lot of different ways and talk about what evidences there are in science that support that macroevolutionary concept. Now, there are some that say that most of these processes we're talking about are not actually very likely to occur in nature, okay? That they're so complex, the events that are required here, that the probability of them actually occurring, these genetic changes that would lead to new features, that's an impossibility that would ever occur. Not only the formation of the first life form, but the formation of new features within an organism, new primary features of an organism, cannot form purely by random chance changes in the genetic code and that sort of thing. So there's that viewpoint, and there are a lot of people who are doing statistical analysis and looking at probabilities and explanations for how things might occur or how they probably can't occur in nature. So anyway, that's part of the picture as well.